Very good. How about you?
Yeah, not too bad. Right. Okay, so the Nearpod code for today just posted into the classroom is YABGT. YABGT, continuing on in our investigation about the evil of inflation. YABGT. If you could jump in, join the Nearpod. Right. Now, the Nearpod code is obviously in the top left-hand corner of the Nearpod. And if I do this, so I'm finding that they've moved all the buttons around in the new version. All right. So YABGT is the code. That's it there. YABGT. So if you could join in, excellent. Thank you for coming along to the Nearpod. And we're going to be discussing the second evil in macroeconomics, the idea of inflation. Now, it is a big concern, particularly in America at the moment. There is a lot of people discussing, is inflation going to become a problem in America? Now, at the moment, we're all worried about the pandemic, okay, and we're worried, therefore, about the health and well-being of our citizens, and we're also worried about jobs and people's income levels, mental health issues, all of those. But then there's a concern about inflation after all of that. So, all right, we decided the other day that inflation was about the changes to prices over time. So the example that we used was the coffee price, all right, in America between 1970 and 2019. And then we had a wee discussion about whether there are some prices that you know of that have changed over time. It might be helpful to think about some of those prices, to have them in mind so that you can understand on a personal level how inflation has affected you. I mean, I mentioned how the price of movie tickets in New Zealand had changed dramatically since when I was a child to, as an adult, okay? So inflation is all about this idea of the price of a good or service changing over time, all right? So very specifically, just giving ourselves a good definition for a base here. Inflation is going to be defined as a sustained, that means continuous, all right, increase in the general level of prices. So because we're using the word general here, we're not saying everything's going to be increasing. We're saying kind of like an average. On average, everything's going to be increasing with regards to prices, but there will be some that might actually decrease in price. All right? And we tend to measure it using a device called the Consumer Price Index. Right? Now, there are other indexes, and we're going to mention at least one. Right? But the main one we focus on is the Consumer Price Index because, well, we're consumers and it affects us. Okay? And then we vote the politicians in and so on and so forth. So they're actually going to use as well, to a greater or lesser extent, the Consumer Price Index as their measure for inflation. We often talk about an inflation rate. So that's that idea of a rate of change. All right? So we talk then about an annual percentage change in the price level. Right? So we're going to use this idea of a consumer price index and we're going to work out the percentage change in the consumer price index. And we're going to say, well, this consumer price index is 3% higher than this consumer price index, therefore inflation has risen by 3%. That's the general idea that we're talking about. So we're talking about an inflation rate. A rise in the overall price level will mean, as you discovered, a fall in your ability to buy goods and services, your purchasing power, your ability to buy goods and services. So because things are more expensive, because the price level has risen, what you are going to be able to buy decreases. So the further and faster prices rise, the more significant or bigger the impact that then has on your purchasing power. So the hyperinflation example that we gave you the other day, right? The idea that prices can just keep going and going and going and going and rising and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, means for you as a consumer, your purchasing power in that context gets smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we would consider inflation to be evil. It robs people. We actually, in the past, have used that term. It robs people of their purchasing power. Right? And particularly if you're thinking people on lower incomes, right, that's going to have a really big effect. So when prices rise, the real purchasing power of your cash decreases, declines. So very quickly, here's a quick fill in the gaps. You'll know this one. All right, so have a go. Give you a couple of seconds, get through that one. Good work, Emma. Well done. Have a go, team. Good work. See, there we go. Very fast. Well done. Let's wait on a couple more. Good work, Irina. Well done. Okay, just waiting on. Here we go, Brandon. Good work. Hong and Abu. Let's see what you can come up with. Good work. Well done. Okay, just a couple more seconds. Try and, Hong, if you can add that yours in. All right, so inflation is a sustained increase in the general level of prices as measured by the Consumer Price Index. The inflation rate is the annual percentage change in prices. The rise in the price level will mean a fall in the internal purchasing power, the value of money, and when prices rise, the real purchasing power of cash decreases. Now, we discussed that idea of hyperinflation. You had a bit of an exercise about hyperinflation. Here you see the impact cumulatively of hyperinflation with regards to Venezuela, and their inflation rate at that end was over nearly 3,500%. Right, which when you accumulate that, that's an awful lot. That's a massively big level of prices of inflation. And again, the idea of robbing you of your purchasing power. So then we had inflation, and we'd said that deflation was going to be the opposite of inflation. So deflation was going to be when the price level was decreasing. So inflation, we've got a sustained increase in the price level. Deflation, you're going to have a sustained decrease in the price level. But what was hyperinflation again? What about disinflation? Have a go. Good to get to know the terms. You're allowed to ask Dr. Google if you get completely stuck. Here we go. What was hyperinflation all about? What was disinflation? Good work, Shanley. Well done. So, principally wanting to know about hyperinflation, what it is, and disinflation, what it is. Because remember, if we're talking about inflation being evil, and there are different ways that we can sort of envisage inflation, then we should be able to analyze the effects of those inflations as well, and say whether they make the problem worse, right, or maybe they don't make the problem better. Good work, Hong. Well done. Yes, indeed. 100% right. Well done. Yes, that's right, Irina. Yes, well done. Yes, good. So we had deflation, which was the decline in inflation. So if you imagine in your head, so if I'll open a whiteboard here just so that you can see. And if I can draw a line, let me see here. So if we have this is prices. All right, so above this line, all of the prices are going to be positive. And below it, they're all going to be negative. All right, you can imagine inflation doing this, and then this, and this. Maybe does this a bit, and then maybe he does that. Okay, so under this sort of set of circumstances, here you've got an increasing level of prices. All right, so this section here, let's try. Oh, I can do colors. This section here is going to be inflationary. This section here is going to be deflationary because it's below zero. It's negative, so there's actually a decrease in the price level. This one here is still inflation. It's just inflation that is decreasing. Right? So it's a decreasing rate of change. So it's kind of like you're in the car, you've been accelerating, and now you are decelerating. Okay, you're not putting the car in reverse, you're decelerating. So you're still moving forwards, you're just moving forwards at a slower rate. So this bit here would be disinflation, and that bit there would be inflation, that bit there deflation, and then this section here, because we'd say it's a rapidly increasing level of prices, more likely to be classified as hyperinflation. All right, now, let me get rid of that. Okay. Now, we need to know what causes inflation. Remember, keeping our prices low and stable is going to be part of the job of the government. It's going to be something we vote governments in and out on. So they need to know what causes inflation, because it's like a medical doctor. You need to know the cause if you're going to sort out the problem, okay? So politicians, economists, and us, we're going to be figuring out what causes inflation. So we can look at internal causes and external. So causes that are inside the economy and causes that are outside of the economy. So a classic one, and this is the case, say, in the UK and in New Zealand, where we've seen a massive surge increase, fancy word for increase, in property prices, housing prices, just gone through the roof. In New Zealand, if you look at the prices in Auckland, in the major city in Auckland, you're not going to find hardly any houses, maybe hardly any houses that you want to live in under the price of $1 million. All right, that's New Zealand dollars. So multiply that by 4 to get ringgit. Right? And that's how expensive it is to live there. Yeah. So that increase in property prices means that there's a big demand for housing, but also that there's a demand for people's wages to rise, right, so that they can afford their houses. So then you get the higher wage costs. Now, higher wage costs could also come about because there's increase in specialization and skills. Could be because there's an increase in the minimum wage. You know, could be a whole range of different reasons why. There could be higher wage costs. Could be that there's been an increase in the amount of credit available in the economy. And this is definitely the case in America. Now, we've talked a bit about America before. And in America, the average number of credit cards, it was a while back at any rate, was per person was 5. All right? That's credit cards. That's not debit cards. And what was happening in the lead up to the global financial crisis in 2008 is people were using one credit card to pay off another credit card, okay, which then they used to pay off another credit card, and so on. And they just never got out of that sort of debt. But it did mean that there was a big increase in spending. People were buying all sorts of things, right? Big new cars, etc. And as a result, it potentially led to some inflation. Could be that there's an increase in business taxes, you know, things like the VAT, the value added tax, GST, all of those sorts of business taxes. So they are inside the economy and they could cause the price levels to rise. If taxes go up, then we would expect businesses to increase prices in order to recover their profits. If there's an increase in demand based on more money, more credit available, then again, we would expect to see the price level to go up. All right? There's another cost, right, for businesses, and then there's the demand idea as well, all inside the economy. But if we look outside the economy, we could see costs that affect our economy that we don't have any control over. Right? The world price of oil, okay, which, I mean, yes, has been relatively low of late, but it could actually increase. Right? And that causes the costs within businesses in our country to also potentially increase. And this is actually happening right now. Inflation and global commodity prices. So those raw materials that we use to make all of the goods and services, the prices of those are going up big time, right? Because we had the pandemic decrease in the economies, there was less demand for goods and services. Now there's a whole lot of demand for goods and services, there's so much demand for goods and services that they can't keep up with that demand, and that is causing the prices of commodities to actually go higher. So there is a big inflation at the moment in commodity prices around the world. Exchange rates, again, you don't necessarily have much control over that. It tends to be the demand for your currency from other countries and other people. And again, at the moment, we're not seeing a lot of international travel, if any. So there's going to be very little movement that way with regards to exchange rates, but potentially, yes, through trade, a lot more. And if there's inflation in other countries, so if there's inflation in China and we buy our goods from China, then the cost of those goods is going to rise. So external causes for inflation and internal causes. We can simplify it, and we will. All right. But first, so we're going to simplify. So the very first way to simplify is just to think about the things that cost businesses. Right? So if we're thinking costs, so even whether it's internal or external, if anything causes the costs of production to rise, and when I say the cost of production, I'm not talking about cost of production for one business or one product. We're talking about the cost of production for pretty much every product and every business within a country. Then if that was to happen, then what we would say is we would experience cost push inflation. So the costs of production are increasing. It should therefore lead to an inward supply, inward shift in the total or aggregate supply curve, right? Because it's more expensive to produce. And that leads to businesses raising their prices. Wages quite often follow, because when prices rise, you as a worker are going to want a wage increase in order to cope with the higher prices. And the danger with that is it might end up being a wage price spiral. So because you're asking your boss, I want a pay rise, your boss says, okay, I'll give you a pay rise, but that then increases their costs. So they then have to increase, again, their prices in order to protect their profits. But then you then can't buy the goods and services, so you then have to ask for another wage rise, and it just escalates. It's a spiral that goes upwards. Right? So cost push inflation, the cost of production rising, it causes the total supply or aggregate total supply of all goods and services in an economy, the total supply, to actually shift inwards. That causes prices to rise. Wages quite often follow that, and we might end up with what's called a wage price spiral. So next task, fill in the gaps. All right, it'll appear on the screen. Away you go. This one's a bit more tricky. Have a go. Cost push inflation. What is it all about? All right, oh, some good efforts coming in now. Well done. Keep going. Wait for the rest of you. All right, have a go, team. Well done. Just another couple to have a go. Good work. Well done. About 30 more seconds. Good work. Just waiting on a couple more. Cost push inflation occurs when the costs of production are increasing. This leads to an inward shift of the short-run aggregate or total supply curve. Right? Firms will raise their prices in order to protect the levels of profits that they have. Wages quite often will follow the increase in prices. It might lead to a rise in what's called pay claims. We claim that we want more pay, and that will be known as a wage price spiral. Excuse me. All right. So that was cost push inflation. And here's a wee visual illustration. You don't need to worry too much about this. This is just so that you can visually get your head around what we're talking about. If we imagine our supply for every product in the economy being here, and our demand for all the products in the economy being this curve here, there's a price level, right? So everything that we produce here, everything that we demand. So that's our aggregate or total supply and our aggregate or total demand. Now, strictly speaking, you don't need to draw these, but I'm just wanting to show this to you so you can actually get a visual understanding of what we're talking about with regards to cost push. So what we said is that there was a rise in costs. That then is going to affect supply. So there it is. Supply shifts to the left, right, which is going to then have an impact on the price level for everything. Right. So shifts in AS are caused by changes in costs. For example, rise in the price of oil price. Rise in oil prices leads to a higher cost and an inward shift in aggregate supply. Right, so that's what we see. So there's the increase in the price level there, caused by that decrease in total supply. Now, another approach would be to consider the demand side, so the total amount of demand in an economy. And if there is a lot of demand, which there has been of late, if there is a lot of demand, it might be rising faster than our ability to supply the goods and services, and that's definitely what's been happening of late. So as a result of that, businesses are going to increase their prices because that will enable them to increase their profit margins, and we call it demand pull inflation. And we suggest that it's in a boom phase of an economic cycle. It isn't necessarily, but that's what we might suggest. So demand pull inflation, increase in total demand, aggregate demand, leading to businesses raising their prices, increasing their profit margins. So you know what you're going to have to do. Close exercise and ready, go. All right. Here we go. Close the gaps. What about demand pull inflation? Oh, good work, Emma. Well done. Well done, Harina. Just a couple more to have a go. Okay, just waiting on a couple more. Work. Work, Abu. Come on, Brandon. Home, man, have a go. Okay, a couple more seconds. Right, so demand pull inflation, that's where we said our aggregate or our total demand was going to be rising faster than our ability to supply. goods and services, supply goods and services that led to an excess of demand. Businesses tend to respond by raising their prices to increase their profit margins. Demand pull inflation is often associated with the boom phase of the economic cycle. It's one of the reasons why everything's a bit cloudy and people are a bit uncertain about inflation at the moment, because there is a big increase in demand all around the world, but the reason why there's a big increase in demand all around the world is because there was a big drop in demand and it's kind of picking back up, but there's still a lot of uncertainty around the world, obviously, at the moment. Now, if we have a think about them visually, now again, you don't necessarily need to do these particular graphs, but I wanted to show them to you so again you could see what it means. So demand pull. So if you have an aggregate supply curve again, an aggregate demand, so total supply, total demand of everything in the economy, price level, because you're talking then about the prices for the entire economy. We talked about an increase in demand. So that's a demand, total demand shifting to the right. And as that was going to happen, there was initially a shortage, and then that is going to drive up the price level. So a high level of aggregate or total demand, e.g. caused by rising consumer spending, puts upward pressure on the price level there. So that would then be classified as demand pull inflation. Now, we're going to be having a think about the consequences. Consequences is, costs, maybe. Costs of inflation, the consequences of inflation. The reason, again, why we classify inflation as being an evil. Some of the ideas that we're going to cover, we're going to be thinking about something called menu costs. We're going to be thinking about something called shoe leather costs. We are going to be talking about hyperinflation again. We're talking about the value of money in and of itself, so your purchasing power tied with that, and then, of course, the idea of a wage price spiral. All right, I'm just going to stop sharing and jump back to the meet, just like this. All right, now, team, here's what we need you to do. I need you now, right? Yeah, the recording from the lesson is going to go up online once it's all processed and all of those sorts of things. But we are going to stop there for the day because you've learned a whole bunch. Right. Next time we meet, which by my count is tomorrow, right? Next time that we meet, I'm going to be wanting you to have a really good definition for inflation, deflation, hyperinflation, and disinflation. So those 4 key terms between now, I know it's a short time, now and tomorrow, right? You've already got a good start on that today. What would be amazing is if you could also get a good understanding down of cost push inflation and demand pull inflation, because we're going to do a little bit more work on that again tomorrow, right? So for next lesson, those 4 key terms, inflation, deflation, hyperinflation, disinflation, and then the understanding about cost push as a cause of inflation, and the understanding about demand pull as a cause of inflation. So if you can get all of that down, I know it's a short turnaround between now and tomorrow, all right, but have a go, all right, and we're going to have a wee practice at those key concepts, just those, as part of tomorrow's lesson. Is that all understood? Are we all okay with that? Yes, fantastic. All right, team. So what we're going to say then is we're going to give you a break now, obviously before your break, but also before your next lesson. And during this time, you might like to go back through those definitions, start making some notes about the cost push and demand pull, and obviously start going through those definitions. So you've got all of that down before tomorrow. Otherwise, as we'd say in the land of my birth, hei kone rā, which means goodbye for now. Thank you. See you. You're still here, Lancelot? Do that.